Hello, everyone, and welcome to this morning's session, high-level plenary on solutions for advancing green industrialization and sustainable value chains. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist, the Brussels correspondent for the international news station France 24, and also a senior writer for the website energymonitor.ai, and I'm going to be walking us through this conversation this morning. So we keep hearing about green industrialization, the green industrial revolution, and how it's pivotal in the effort to decarbonize the energy and transportation sectors. But what exactly does this mean? And what does it actually mean for people in particular on the ground? That's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Now, the importance of technologies like solar and battery storage has surged over the last decade, yet supply chains for these technologies remain largely concentrated in a handful of countries. This dependency is particularly pronounced among lower middle-income countries and will present a bottleneck for accelerating the energy transition. The participation of developing countries in global supply chains remains relatively limited. For instance, in the solar industry, the International Solar Alliance illustrates that solar manufacturing in developing countries remains limited and is primarily represented by Southeast Asia. Data from the Global Wind Energy Council also reveals similar trends in other critical value chains, such as wind and battery manufacturing, with China and the US leading the production capacities, followed by the EU, Japan, and South Korea. Now, the energy transition presents an opportunity for developing countries to drive green industrialization, especially with the resource endowment across the African continent, for instance. Key minerals are essential in the production of clean energy technologies, yet many nations export them without value addition through processing and refining. Middle and low-income countries could increase their domestic value addition by localizing mineral processing and refining. And these countries could also leverage their labor cost advantage to significantly reduce the manufacturing expenses of clean energy technologies. So there's a lot of opportunity there for the developing world and for the countries that are right now not intimately involved with the supply chain. In this session, we're going to examine the current landscape of policies and programs that are promoting the interlinkage of energy policy and industrial policy to advance energy, climate, and development goals. What are the opportunities and solutions that can be promoted nationally, regionally, and globally to advance green industrialization and support the diversification of supply chains for low-carbon technologies? To get us started, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Arunabha Ghosh, who is CEO of the Council for Energy, Environment, and Water. Arunabha?
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Keating. Your Excellency, Minister Gewessler, Ms. Abu Zaid, Mr. Jean-Francois Garnier, and Mr. Kobayashi, I believe you'll be joining us virtually. And ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for having me as part of this conversation this morning. It's raining outside heavily. In other places, there's drought. In other places, there are floods. In other places, there are forest fires. 30 years on since the UN Framework for Climate Change was initialed, two things have changed. First, the climate change challenge has now become a climate crisis challenge. And number two, it is no longer an environmental issue alone. It is a matter of our economies, of our industrial development strategies, of our sustainable development ideals and goals. If you take 2023 as an instance, it's going to be the hottest year on record. There have been devastating floods across the world, from Libya to India to Greece and China. Brazil is facing its worst droughts. Canada and Hawaii have seen raging wildfires. But when it comes to industrialization, one of the things we haven't entirely internalized is what should businesses do? So I propose to you that first, businesses have to become more climate focused. Last year, the UN Secretary General appointed me to the high-level expert group on net zero commitments of corporations. And one of the things we outlined very clearly in our recommendations was that it is not enough to just announce a net zero target. Businesses have to have a clear pathway of how to get there, not just in the long term, but in the interim, medium term, and short term as well. Moreover, businesses also have to become more climate ready. So it's not just enough to understand that there is climate change happening elsewhere. We have to understand what it means for business risk. In the first half of 2023 alone, about $120 billion of damages have occurred, and yet only $50 billion were insured. So if you were going to invest tens of millions of dollars in a factory, the last thing you want is for it to be flooded 5 years down the line. And then, of course, businesses have to become climate friendly. Means tap into the opportunity that the low-carbon transition presents before us. And this is where the environmental logic gets challenged by an economic logic. I grew up I studied as an economist, and one of the things we were taught was that industrial policy is bad. Another thing we were taught is that money automatically flows from capital-rich to capital-poor regions. The third thing we were taught is that labor markets are fluid, and in some ways, geography doesn't really matter. A fourth thing we were taught is technology, or the X factor in our growth equations, was exogenously determined. And the fifth thing we were taught, that if the price is right, energy and resources will not be a constraint. So you can guess that me being a failed economist, you know where I'm going. None of those 5 economic things I was taught any longer hold true. So we need a reality check. Manufacturing is concentrated. As Mr. Keating just mentioned, over 60% of global manufacturing of solar PV, wind, and battery technologies and components is concentrated in a single country. These manufacturing concentrations lead to increasingly vulnerable imports for many countries, but particularly for low middle income and middle income countries. Nearly 100% of these countries were almost entirely dependent on concentrated imports over the past decade. Meanwhile, industrial policy in the European Union, in the United States, and to an extent in other parts of the world, while necessary to drive the clean transition in these geographies, is also risking taking away investment from the developing countries and the emerging markets. A second reality check is something that the Nobel laureate Robert Lucas pointed out as the Lucas paradox. The money actually does not flow from capital-rich to capital-poor regions, or as I like to crudely say, money does not flow where the sun shines the most. The cost of capital in emerging markets and developing countries are several percentage points higher than in OECD countries, in part because of risks that are real, but in large part because of risks that are perceived and not real. The other challenge is that technology is not just exogenously determined. We notice that the bulk of the patents for clean energy technologies are concentrated in a handful of countries. In fact, 95% of clean energy technology patents are owned by citizens in high-income and upper-middle-income countries. What is more challenging, however, is that many of these patents will not expire before the time we all have to get to net zero, which means you can't get into a reverse engineering of these technologies. And the final reality check we need is that in a time of energy insecurity, 50 years after the last major energy crisis that drove a sense of energy security cooperation across the world, we haven't really figured out how do we get energy security not for just fuels of the past, but the fuels of the future, whether it's a solar panel, a wind turbine, a battery, or a critical mineral inside that battery. Just 2 months ago, at the Leaders' Summit of the G20 that was held in New Delhi, the leaders came out and announced quite boldly something called GDP. But it doesn't stand for gross domestic product. The G20 leaders were saying GDP is now a green development pact. So if we take these failed economic lessons and take these reality checks, what does that then mean in forging a new pact for green development that is for sustainability, industrialization, jobs for all? And as I conclude, let me just outline 5 ideas. 1, we have to keep the global market for clean energy technologies free, open, and transparent. Cartelization, creating islands of regulation, and creating non-tariff barriers is neither economically efficient nor politically wise. Number 2, while we head into COP28 just a few weeks from now, we cannot just think about climate finance for deployment of clean energy technologies. We also have to think about lower cost climate finance to invert the Lucas paradox, to build the manufacturing capacity and the supply chains across the economies, whether they're high income, middle income, or low income. Number 3, we have to tap into the inherent strengths in developing countries that are also going to be the source of critical minerals. How do we increase value addition at home rather than just continue to serve as big mines for our so-called cleaner future? Number 4, how do we then create a new paradigm of technology co-development, where we pool not just finances, but also technical resources and human resources, and use the geographies in the developing countries and emerging markets as the laboratory for the technologies that have to be developed. And finally, how do we create a rules-based architecture for the fuels of the future, such as green hydrogen, so that we don't have islands of regulation that create a sense of an opportunity now, but a failed marketplace globally. So as I conclude, here are some final thoughts from a failed economist. Economics 101 makes sense only when we make severe assumptions about the real world. When we stop expecting that the theory should fit reality, or reality should fit theory, we start getting down into the nuts and bolts of what it will take to create a clean future, which is also just jobs, growth, and sustainability for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosh. Some really interesting items there, some really interesting food for thought for our panel, to be sure. Let me introduce to you now our panelists that we have with us here to discuss some of these issues. We have sitting here to my right, Leonora Gewessler, who is the Federal Minister for Climate Action, Environment, Energy, Mobility, and Innovation and Technology for Austria, our host country that we're in right now. We have Amani Abu Zaid, who is Commissioner on Energy and Infrastructure for the African Union. We have Jean-Francois Gagné, who is head of the Clean Energy Ministerial Secretariat. And joining us remotely, we have Uzuru Kobayashi, who is the Director General for Environmental Affairs for the Ministry of Economy, Technology, and Industry of Japan. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us here today. Let me start out with an opening question to each of you, which builds upon what Mr. Ghosh was just speaking about there, which are the current challenges of flows of where this essential technology is going, a bit about what I was speaking about in the beginning. What are, Minister Gewessler, would you say, what are the current challenges of energy technology value chains, and how can developing countries reduce their technological dependency on imports?
Well, first of all, since this is the first time I address this forum, I'd just like to start with a brief thanks to UNIDO for organizing yet another great conference. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in this distinguished group of people at the crucial moment in time, not only because we're heading into COP28, particularly important COP this year, but also because we are at a time where we build the fundamentals for a long-term future. And we do this in a very exceptional time. I mean, we shouldn't forget while we discuss supply chains and decarbonization pathways and the industrial future, we have to keep in mind that we are facing geopolitical turmoil to an extent that we probably hardly many people of us would have imagined probably even a couple of months ago. And that we're still in a situation where economies recover from supply chain disruption, both from the COVID-19 pandemic as well as from the energy crisis that ensued the war in Ukraine, Russia's illegal aggression in Ukraine. But at the same time, and I'd like to pick up what you said, exactly this time is an opportunity to not repeat some mistakes we did in the past, but to build the supply chains of the future in a more transparent, in a more just, in a more sustainable and cheap and inclusive way. And of course, this sounds easier said than it's practically done. I very much like, we cannot just make reality fit the theory, but we have to do the necessary changes in real life. And I think it starts with a couple of things. I mean, first, I think it's really a big change, a big chance. The energy transition is a big chance to redo also the geopoliticals of the energy system. And it will be crucial in doing this to make sure that we have governance standards that include or ensure that people on the ground can actually benefit, and that we have environmental, social, and governance standards that make sure this transition really benefits the people on the ground. So yes, absolutely we need to stop thinking about the global south as just an export market or a supplier of raw materials, and use this transition now as a moment in time to get some of the things right. What does it need to really harvest the potential that many countries of the global south have in actually becoming leaders of the energy transition? So I think one is skilling. I mean, that's a challenge we have in the global north, in Austria just the same, but I think that's a global challenge. So the preparation of skilling and upskilling programs for the labor capacity that we need in the future, or already now, not so distant future. Educating and training people in renewable energy technologies will be key to have that boost. Additionally, of course, there's some work to be done on the ground in terms of energy infrastructure, in terms of a regulatory framework, in terms of also creating some of the financial things like investment guarantees on the ground. But I would absolutely take up what you said. This is a task also for the global north in terms of, so not just saying what needs to be done on the ground, but also what do we in the global north need to do to support in the energy transition in the global south. And I think, first of all, there is work to do in reframing the financial framework, okay, sorry for that doubling, but in making sure that we align financial flows, not just public, but all financial flows, that I insist on that, to make sure we invest in a good future globally. So I think this needs a multitude of instruments to de-risk investment, to address the challenge of cost of capital. I think in terms of creating new partnerships, and I think they will come back maybe later in the debate, the way we address new partnerships, for example, in the hydrogen world, it needs to be at an eye-to-eye level, making sure that the countries also benefit from the renewables expansion. This needs as a precondition first. And I think really to have these fundamentals in mind will help countries to harvest on the potential, but also make sure we narrow the decarbonization divide that we see at the moment, and that is a challenge in the run-up to the COP28. Just a few thoughts for the beginning, lots of work to do.
Certainly lots of work to do. Commissioner, let's turn to you next. So what would you say are the current challenges of the technology value chain as it exists today, and how can developing countries reduce their technological dependency? You want to grab your microphone there?
Thank you, Dave, and likewise, it's the first time I address this important audience, and allow me at the outset to thank Austria for the kind hospitality, and UNIDO and all the partners who set up this event. It's my first also time I participate in this forum, so it's a great pleasure, and definitely we had a very strong start yesterday. I do represent the continent of Africa, and my continent, we don't refer to it as Global South or anything. It's a term that we do not recognize at all. We are developing countries. Some of our countries are middle income. Some of our countries are lower income countries. And before I start with the challenges, I would like to remind the audience, because yesterday I'm sure you heard about the landscape of issues that was ably represented and shared with the audience by my sister, Her Excellency Cristina Duarte. Let me add to what she had said yesterday. We are the continent that is youngest in the world. We are the continent that's the fast digitalizing in the world. We are the continent where the share of renewable energy is the highest in the world, because Africa, 40.5% of our energy comes from green sources. We have almost 20 countries whose energy mainly comes from renewable sources. We have 3 or 4 countries whose 90% of their energy comes from renewable sources. Yet, we are also the hardest hit by climate issues. And these are causing devastations beyond the socioeconomic losses to go into even, peace and security, as we all know. This comes at a time when we are also the region whose emission is the lowest. So while we're having great opportunities, including the abundance of renewable energy sources and abundance of minerals, which we call, by the way, development minerals, not green minerals. So our development minerals, we're not seeing the development in terms of technological or manufacturing development happening in our continent as we would have wished it to be. The challenges would be, we are smaller economies, not necessarily connected. We are also, more of half of our population do not have access to electricity, so we are not even into the discussion about transition. We are still at the level of access. And the investments, it was alluded to in the keynote speech, we did 2 or 3% of climate finance. The regular finance that reaches our continent is 10 times higher, not just few notches in terms of percentage. So while, for instance, we see in Portugal or in Greece, they pay 0.6 or 0.7% as interest rate, our poor countries pay 12%. So in terms of development, this, of course, decimates any ambition and at least makes it very difficult for things to materialize in our continent. However, as I said, we are making great strides in terms of green energy out of necessity. So we have been convinced a long time ago for ourselves, by ourselves, that green energy, because of its abundance, could also be a great opportunity for us. So what we need for this to happen, for the supply chain to be effective in Africa, we need, it was mentioned, value addition, of course, through partnerships, through technology transfer, through affordable finance that is real and realistic, away from the assumptions made somewhere else outside the continent about risk, perception in Africa, which is totally and fundamentally unreal and unfounded. And of course, you have the literature to support this, plenty. Last but not least, and this goes for all of us, not just Africa, I am still asking the question. Only 2 months after COVID erupted, the whole world stopped and the whole world made it a crisis and took the necessary actions to address it. Even within 3 or 4 months, vaccines were found, finance was delivered, affordable finance. Why climate is not having the same treatment, where it is a matter of survival. We live or we die. So that is the big question. And this is, the issue that we all have to make sure it happens, that the world wakes up and make climate a crisis and address it very urgently. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Like a lot of people observed, we managed to react so rapidly to the COVID crisis. It shows that we can do it. Why aren't we doing it for climate? Jean-Francois Gagné, what is your take on how we can shake up supply chains to make sure that these types of issues we've been talking about can change?
Well, thanks for the question. And I'll join others in thanking both UNIDO for organizing this great forum and this very important dialogue, and also the Austrian government for the fantastic hosting. I've never been seen as many impressive venues in one single area, so thank you very much for that. But maybe I can start by maybe framing the question, at least in my mind, under 2 different aspects. First, in the question you asked, how do we limit our dependencies on imports? And I think, based on what Mr. Gauche said, I think we need to reframe this a little bit, because being Canadian, coming from a country where there's actually more economic activities coming from north-south border crossings than there is across the country, we have to go back to the point that we are in a global market and we can't be creating artificial barriers. And so the issue is not limiting the import dependency. The issue is about maximizing local benefits and limiting supply chain risks. And that is, I think, the real question that we need to ask, and how can collaboration help in that? The other reframing is, I think there's 2 technology supply chain issues that need to be addressed. One is the access to solutions themselves. And so we've seen about, how it is important to collaborate. I really like the Commissioner's point about, Africa looking at green energy as a need for itself. There needs to be capacity built in each of the countries to be able to identify the right solutions to be able to meet the local needs and the local objectives. And so this collaboration is a lot of what we try to do with the SEM, is to bring people who have already gone through some of the hurdles to talk to the people who are about to go through, share best practices, but most importantly, put those best practices in the context of where they will be implemented, because a solution that works in a certain environment may not be the right solution for a second environment. So there needs to be that capacity building for each of the local communities to be able to identify their own solutions, their own priorities, and then be able to decide how to best achieve their needs. The second point, though, is once those plans have been made, once those solutions have been decided upon, you still need to be able to get access to them, and that's where the industrialization supply chains becomes important. And that's also where it was very interesting. You were talking about the energy crisis of 50 years ago. I think we might have a hard time learning from our mistakes. We were talking about COVID a few minutes ago. If there's one thing we also saw in COVID, is how our global supply chains, not only for energy, were extremely fragile because of the too many bottlenecks. So again, the issue isn't about, I need to do everything myself, because no country's an island in this issue. It's about, how can I enable multiple supply chain opportunities and be able to build on everyone's endowments and everyone's specific capacity to maximize local benefits, but create partnerships to make sure that the supply chains actually provide me with the best opportunity at the best cost. Because if we all do everything ourselves, it's a very, very expensive way to kind of secure our own supply chain. So that's what we try to do again with the Clean Energy Ministerials, to identify those opportunities, bringing together not only governments, but also the private sector, financiers, to be able to look at the entire supply chain of issues. What are some of the bottlenecks? Who is best placed to address what issue? And how can we then work together to try to come up with solutions that allow us to not create new problems while we are solving old ones?
Mr. Kobayashi, how do you think we can adjust value chains to make them both more efficient and also more equal, reducing dependency?
Well, thank you. And first, like other panelists, because this is my first time to participate in this very important forum, I would like to thank the organizers, Australian government and UNIDO, to give me such a precious opportunity to join this prestigious panel. Regarding your question, yes, energy technology supply chain, as you well know, we see there are too much concentrations to just one country, China. And China is by far the dominant producer of solar panel, and is starting to dominate the wind power industry, battery industry, refining process of the critical minerals, and even nuclear power industry. So from the viewpoint of energy security and economic security, it is quite important to diversify the producing countries in Japan, the United States, European countries, and some others are now adopting policies to enhance their capability of producing key green energy products by themselves or outside China. And I think the developing countries, especially LDCs, would have a chance to play a role in these new supply chains, and especially for critical minerals, but others as well. And however, I think the LDCs and also developing countries should play a part in the global supply chain of major industrial products, including but not limited to clean energy-related products. And that's something which we need to aim for. And in this context, I think the developing countries, especially LDCs, are facing a very big challenge because of the stable supply of electricity is a critical element for the modern manufacturing industry. Unfortunately, the solar and wind, they are very important, but they cannot be a stable source of electricity only by themselves. Dispatchable sources of electricity are needed to mitigate the intermittency. And unless hydro or nuclear power are available, the thermal power at this moment is the only option. However, it is increasingly difficult for developing countries, especially LDCs, to build new thermal power plants. And not only OECD countries, but also China announced that they no longer support international CFPs. And the G7 leaders decided not to provide the direct public support for the international unabated fossil fuel energy sector by the end of 2022, except in limited circumstances. I think we, especially an organization like UNIDO, really need to consider how LDCs can host modern manufacturing industries, including but not limited to the clean energy-related supply chains under these constraints. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So, Minister, I wanted to come back with the point you made before about collaboration and how important it is. So, of course, you have possible collaboration between the public and private sector, but you also have possibilities for collaboration between countries and more broadly, collaboration between developed countries and developing countries. How is Austria actually implementing that idea that you referred to before? What are some of the partnerships in green industrial development regionally and globally that you're exploring?
Of course, I could go on a long way how we try to address this change. And yes, I think that the challenge we've we have globally in decarbonization is huge, and the solutions will differ from time to time, but the magnitude of the challenge, I think, is big no matter in which part of the country or this wonderful planet you're sitting. So while we try everything we can to do our own homework back home in order to make sure our industry transitions from one based on fossil fuels, one based on a linear economy, to one based on renewables in a circular way, we are very well aware of the fact we will not be able to do this alone. So just to have one look at one of the key issues that are important for us is the hydrogen supply chain. Because for hard-to-abate sectors, and that's how we build the whole architecture of this transition in the Austrian context, hydrogen will be one of the key pathways. So we don't need it anywhere else, we need it in the hard-to-abate sectors in industry. Even if we mobilize the maximum of our own production domestically, if we focus it completely on the industries that need it, there's no way we will be able to supply our industries with the hydrogen needed from domestic production. So imports will be crucial. Will be crucial for our for transitioning our industry to a good future. And Austria is not just a country with a lot of historical things to see, but it's actually a country with a huge industry base. And so for us, this is really a crucial question for the future. So how do we address that? We currently see that that's good news, that hydrogen production will not only occur where there is currently oil and gas fields. So when I said earlier, this is the potential to, this moment in time is a potential to change the geopolitics of the energy system, this is exactly one of the fields where this happens. So what we try to do in our partnerships, for example, with countries in the north of the African continent, is to develop the partnerships in a way that for the green hydrogen production, you need to ramp up first the renewable production. So we want to make sure that the production and use of renewable energy within those countries doesn't only have an export focus, but we want to try to support also the uptake in the countries, in our partner countries nationally, because as you said, that's a key part of the equation. And in trying to do so, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we're teaming up with partners who have a lot of expertise in doing so. So for example, with UNIDO, Austria has been a core partner of the Global Partnership for Hydrogen in Industry since its launch in the Vienna Energy Forum in 2021. So for example, we did a common workshop and event in Tunisia earlier this year, where we covered the renewable energy technologies both for steel and the chemical industry. And I think this is really one of the frameworks where we try to use the expertise that's there, the networks that are there, and to collectively advance in a way that is a benefit for all the partners involved.
Well, on the same theme of cooperation, Commissioner, when we're looking at, you referred to before the green minerals of Africa that are so valuable, and yet the value is not being completely harnessed. How would you say Africa can benefit from the opportunity to drive its own development and industrialization? And how does the African Union specifically help African countries do that by cooperating?
We have actually, if you're talking about specifically about our development minerals, we do have a strategy through our African Mineral Center, and also our economic arm, the African Development Bank. We have the African Natural Resources Center with a strategy of, the value addition of the minerals and the manufacturing on the ground. Some countries, even the U.S., already started, working with two of our countries, Congo and Zambia, for the manufacturing of batteries. However, this is still starting. We are also working with our countries to rethink the policies and regulations they are putting, because you cannot just ban, and that's what's started to happen now. Some countries are banning this, banning that. The idea here is how to create an environment that is conducive for technology transfer, for investment attraction, so as to create this value. Banning is not a solution. So from our side, working with our African countries, but also with a projection on how the path where to go with our partners. This is actually also one of the things I discussed with UNIDO yesterday. But looking at the bigger picture, the idea of export for export, I think everyone is rethinking this. Not only because it does not create value on the ground, because it also creates other geopolitical issues that we all know of. Taking the example of green hydrogen, through my own country, Egypt is fueling the Maersk ships as we speak now, since last year. We have actually 6 or 7 countries now producing green hydrogen in a matter of months. This is how Africa is fast in adopting technologies. So no one can say they don't have the capacity. When there's a will, there's a way. When Europe wanted or developing countries wanted, the technology transfer happened. The point the minister mentioned is critical, is that it's not only about producing green hydrogen, but how to domesticate this new source of energy into our markets, how to start, producing green fertilizers. We are still also, and we want to encourage also blue fertilizers and blue hydrogen for our own needs, being, natural gas is the cleanest of fossil. So the domestication of these resources, the creating the value chain on the ground is starting, it's recent. We are working with our countries to rethink their policies and regulations. We are working with our partners to rethink the way they work with our countries. And in the meantime, we are creating, the African Union started already 2 years ago, in 2021, the African single energy market. It's going to be the largest in the world, which is projected to take place in 2040. We already started with a master plan for the continent for energy, not to be self-sufficient, and I liked very much your intervention, but to create a space that is conducive for investment, to link the generation with the transmission, with the production, and to benefit from this vast landscape of opportunities across the continent. So that's one of the major endeavors that we are embarking into. I know it sounds too ambitious, but it's going to happen, like Africa always does. We have, of course, our large programs for renewable energy, our large programs for industrializations, which are being rethought to benefit also from the green opportunities that are happening. And frankly speaking, even the geopolitical tensions create opportunities because the world finally realized what we have been saying for 3 decades. Energy is the priority. Like also COVID being also in charge of digitalization. COVID was the best catalyst for digitalization, 2 or 3 years ago. So in a nutshell, beside our projects and programs, to work with our countries, rethink our environment, investment climate, and local policies, with our partners to rethink the way they conduct their partnerships. No country is an island. And another point, climate does not, and that's my assumption, that everyone thinking that we're doing this for the climate. Climate does not recognize geographical borders. So no one can only talk about their country. we have to think collectively, regional and even continental and global. Thank you.
Jean-Francois, so CEM is a prime example of an organization fostering cooperation between countries, right? How exactly do you guys facilitate the cooperation and particularly the knowledge exchange on this topic that can actually transform supply chains?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I mean, this is so encouraging because I think this is the beginning of the CEM process. It's about, countries talking to each other, identifying common objectives, and then figuring out what to do with them. Dr. Yosh talked about earlier being a failed economist. I don't know if I can consider myself a failed engineer, but I'm an aerospace engineer by trade, and if there's one thing that I know is that the devil is always in the details in terms of implementation. That's what we try to do. We try to bring people together, not only governments, but every stakeholder that is needed to be able to achieve this, and have a frank discussion in terms of what challenges are we seeing, who's best placed to try to address them, and then we try to form coalitions to be able to actually act upon them. And we try to really look at things into in a systemic way. We've kind of framed our work in what we call the 3 I's. The first one is about insights. It's about identifying the issues, being able to also identify the best practices, and then, who is the right person to put forward. Some examples, we are working with IESA on a transforming solar initiative that is about looking at exactly the discussion we are about here is how do we make the solar supply chain more resilient, but also more just and inclusive for everyone. We're going to be launching at COP a new initiative on stationary battery storage. Again, part of the pillars that we're looking at the financial arm, we're looking at the government regulations to make the business case, but we're also looking at the resilience of the supply chain in order not to create a new problem as we're trying to solve another one. We're working with UNIDO on an international hydrogen trade forum to be able to link those supply and demand aspects through corridors and being able to have a good view of what those supply chains are. So we're bringing the people together to identify the aspects and then create the coalitions. And that's where we get to the second I, which is the impact, doing the work. And in this case, there are different ways we're doing this. We're looking at making sure the technologies that are needed to be able to make the supply chain more sustainable are there. Whether we're talking work on CCUS, on nuclear, on hydrogen, on clean fuels, on all the technologies, we basically are making sure that we're addressing the latest issue and that there's actually action on the ground to bring those technologies to the right aspects. We also look at the social aspect of things. We have an initiative that's called the Empowering People Initiative that is about maximizing the value of this work and making sure that the people are part of the aspects, but also some of the issues that sometimes people don't think about, such as skills. Will we have the right people to be able to do this job in the little time that we have? So that's part of what we do it. And then lastly, what we work on is the third I, which is inspiration. Because the CEM is a small coalition. What we try to do is we bring people who actually are at the head of the game and who have a vested interest in making things happen for themselves, but we also realize that this is a global issue and we need everyone to be on board. And so we try to bring the advanced solutions that the CEM develops to the masses by partnering with people like UNIDO, like the UN aspects and so forth. And, processes like the G20, like the COP, to make sure that there's as many people who are aware of the solutions, but it's not because you're not a CEM member that you can't work with the CEM. We have 29 member countries, we have 55 countries participating in the CEM initiatives, as well as the private sector and some international organizations. So it's about really creating those concrete action-oriented items to be able to take the ideas that are being put forward by the political fora and really starting action on the ground.
Mr. Kobayashi, Japan recently announced this GX promotion strategy that's designed to promote private investment from a private finance point of view. Now that's building on previous initiatives, collaborating on R&D with the private sector and academia. What's the idea behind this new promotion strategy and how does it differ from previous initiatives?
Well, thank you. And Japan is now aiming for the carbon neutrality by 2050 and a very ambitious NDC 46% emission reduction in 2030 compared to 2013 level. And it means we need to transform the Japanese economy and society from the fossil fuel-based economy to clean energy-based in less than 30 years. So we named the process green transformation, or GX, and the GX actually requires massive investments. And we estimate that the at least 150 trillion yen, equivalent to $1 trillion US under current exchange ratio, is needed in the next 10 years just to kickstart the green transformation process. And of course, private sector needs to cover the large part of the investment cost, but it's very difficult for them to move fast because there are so many uncertainties associated with the transition. So we need the innovation in batteries, hydrogen, solar cells, floating offshore wind, industry decarbonization, and so on. And innovation means uncertainties. And also we need to care about the international competitiveness of our industries during their transformation. So therefore, the government decided to raise 20 trillion yen, or 140 billion US dollars, by issuing a new government bond to support the private sector's investment and R&D activities, in addition to the existing 2.6 trillion yen Green Innovation Fund. The bond will be repaid by the proceeds from the emission trading system and carbon surcharges, which will be implemented from 2026 and 2028 respectively. And one thing I would like to stress is that there are various decarbonization pathways, and respective countries need to develop their own transition pathways in accordance with their conditions and circumstances of their own. And it is also important to pursue decarbonization, economic growth, and energy and economic security simultaneously. And developing such decarbonization policies is very challenging, but that, I think, is the only way for us to mobilize huge resources needed for green transformation. And Japan is not a resource-rich country, and we need to work with other countries to implement green transformation. For example, obviously, if we pursue deployment of hydrogen, we need international supply chains of hydrogen and regulatory framework as well. And Japan announced the Asia Zero Emissions Community Initiative, and now working very closely with ASEAN member states and Australia to pursue decarbonization pathways of respective partner countries. And we also work with the United States, European countries, India, and other economies as well. And we believe international cooperation is very essential for us to move forward. And we are actually aiming for expanding the scope of cooperation.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's really about each country leaning on its strengths and cooperating with others for the things it doesn't have. We have time for one question from the audience. Does anyone have a question for any of the panelists or indeed Mr. Ghosh? Any questions? Yes, we have one here. I think there's a microphone. No, maybe? Yes, there's one coming right here.
Hi, this is actually a question for the Commissioner. I wanted to know now that the AU has joined the G20, what role do you think that the G20 can play to increase market access and supply chains for the African nations? Secondly, do you think the countries in the continent are looking at regulatory changes and policies such as Indonesia's nickel mining policy, wherein they indigenize and build the value chains within the country rather than export just the raw materials?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, you mean the G21. Yes. Well, the G21 is definitely, an important forum. We are currently, it's funny, it's as if you were in the commissioners' meeting, the AU, only 2 weeks ago. So we are we are currently formulating our positions in the different sectors to share with the G20. But it's a very interesting group of countries that among themselves, have lots of expertise, knowledge to share, and technology to collaborate with, with the other parts of the world, including, of course, our 55 countries in the continent. So it is one way, but it's not the only way. We are tapping in each and every opportunity or a grouping of countries or a forum because, again, it's not I know that, I know how much, in terms of wealth and GDP, the G21 represent, but again, this is only part of the world. The only 21 countries of the world, 20 countries and 8 continents of the world. It's not representative of the whole world. And as I said earlier, we have to look at the issues as really global, regional and global. And I keep giving the example of COVID and all what was said on this panel. It took only 2, 3, 4, 8 weeks that, everything stopped and you only realize, what is coming from where and so on and so forth. So it's too early for me to respond specifically on the elements, but it's coming because we're working on it. So before December, we would have, the specific elements that we would like to collaborate, to present and share and collaborate with the 20 countries on that forum. The second question, I think I alluded in my intervention about, the development minerals strategy of the African Minerals Development Center. Please look for it. It's on is on the website. We launched it during the highly successful Africa Climate Week that took place in Kenya early September. Exactly to the points that you mentioned, how to turn the minerals of this mineral, and any of you who have read or visited or seen how those minerals are being extracted and the horrendous violation of human rights and any decency, I believe you will never call it green minerals again. You will never look at an existing battery and think that it's green anymore, unless we really, all of us, whether the producing country, manufacturing countries, if it's different, or importing, exporting, we look at this, the way these minerals are being extracted, and to make sure that the extraction process provides decent jobs, creates value, no wastage, because by the way, as we speak, it already wastes about 20 or 30% of what is being produced. That it's also fueled by green energy, because it still uses fossil fuel, and that it's transported, if exported, using, also green energy. So unless this happens, the whole value chain of the minerals and the manufacturing that are based on these minerals, we cannot call them green. And yes, at the African Union, we are taking the steps to make that happen. Thank you.
We're about out of time, but Mr. Gaveslo, you want to come in quickly on that?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on this very briefly, because fully agree that we need to look at the full production cycle in the renewables supply chain. So that's what we do in the EU currently with the battery legislation, trying to make sure exactly this happens. But I'd like to pick on something else that was mentioned earlier, because it's I don't think I can leave this panel without saying this. We are at the crucial moment in time in front of the COP28. And while we should use any fora we have to advance the climate action agenda, whether it be the G20, the G7, the TEM or Mission Innovation, or whatever we can do, the COP still remains a crucial one. And if we all don't want to go out here as failed climate pioneers, because I think we're all in this together. As you mentioned, this is a global task. I think there's 2 things we need to do. First of all, we need to be coherent, so all of us to do their own homework and collaborate in the way that brings forward coherent climate action. And the second thing is, we need to be coherent also in the policies we advocate. I'm sorry to say there is no such thing as a better fossil fuel. The future is renewable, and that's where we have to really focus our energies on, because otherwise we repeat mistakes of the past. So let's use also this COP as a moment of honesty to ourselves, and to really advance the clean energy transition, to really advance renewables and energy efficiency in this, because this is by far the cheapest, most inclusive, most democratic, with all the difficulties we just discussed, source of energy. So just sorry to say, cannot leave this panel without saying, let's leave fossil fuels as a source of the past. We're going renewable.
And finally, Mr. Ghosh, you wanted to come in quickly as well?
Yeah, as we conclude, I think I just wanted to reiterate that industries don't get built because of bleeding hearts. You know, industries don't get built because of bleeding hearts. We've got to recognize the clear economic rationale for investing in emerging markets and developing countries, because that's where 88% of new electricity demand will come from, and the bulk of global growth will come from over the next 2 decades. So if you're not investing there, that's bad in business decision, not just bad philanthropic decision. And in order to do that, we've got to move from conferences to construction. Let's build and learn from those mistakes and the convergences and the symmetries that we get. You know, otherwise, you know, I disparaged myself a lot about being a failed economist. Actually, what I was trying to hint at is economics has failed. We need a new economics for a just transition. Thank you.
You didn't fail economics. Economics failed you. That's what I say. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists for, I'm afraid we do have to wrap it up now, but there's plenty of time to talk outside after the panel. How about a round of applause for some excellent intervention? Thank you very much to the panelists and to the audience. I wish you a great rest of your day with further stimulating discussions.